Hello?
Yeah.
Hi everyone.
Come on.
Okay. Thanks for coming. I think we should start, even though we are 5 minutes late. So good evening everyone. My name is Natalie and I'm the Vice President for Conferences and Seminars for ELSA Leicester. On behalf of the board, I'd like first to extend a warm welcome to our two speakers, Mr. Greg Judge for Dignity in Dying and Dr. Peter Saunders for Care Not Killing, who kindly agreed to travel here today to join our debate. Secondly, I would like to extend a special welcome to the Neuroscience and Mental Health Society, to the Medical Ethics Student Society and the Canadian Law Society, the boards and members who agreed to join our debate, and of course our ELSA members. Evangelina, the Vice President for Marketing, will talk about ELSA briefly.
The European Law Students Association, also known as ELSA, is an international, independent, non-political, non-profit organization run by and for law students. ELSA activities comprise a large variety of academic and professional events that are organized to fulfill the vision of ELSA. Today, ELSA is the world's largest independent law students association, and it is represented at nearly 300 law faculties in 42 countries across Europe, with membership in excess of 38,000 students and young lawyers. ELSA activities include a large variety of academic and professional events that are organized to fulfill the vision of ELSA and in order to provide opportunities to students to improve their skills and to interact with each other. ELSA is formed by 200 university-based local groups, 42 national groups, and the international board, which are all entirely student-managed and administered. Our purpose is to provide opportunities for law students and young lawyers to learn about other cultures and legal systems in a spirit of critical dialogue and scientific cooperation, to assist law students and young lawyers to be internationally minded and professionally skilled, to encourage law students and young lawyers to act for the good of the society.
Thank you. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome tonight non-lawyers, specifically future doctors and scientists. And this is the reason I'm going to briefly be talking about the legal aspect of the debate, so you guys know what's happening. So it is interesting to note that before 1961, it was a criminal offense to commit or attempt to commit suicide. With the passing of the Suicide Act 1961, committing or attempting to commit suicide was decriminalized. However, the Act, under Section 2.1, preserved the prohibition of assisting another suicide. Providing assistance remains, even today, a criminal offence punishable by 14 years of imprisonment. So, the reality is that a number of British citizens have travelled abroad to end their lives at Dignitas, which is in Switzerland, where assisted suicide is practiced. An example of this is 20-year-old rugby player Daniel James, who back in 2008 travelled to Dignitas with the help of his parents to commit suicide. So under the section, as I mentioned before, section 2.1, his parents were committing a criminal offence because they assisted their suicide. However, they weren't actually prosecuted by the relevant authorities. So there is great controversy around the topic, and there is a vast amount of literature on the matter of assisted suicide and whether the law actually functions. A number of campaign, medical and religious groups support and oppose the current law. For instance, Dignity in Dying campaigns for a greater choice and control at the end of life. On the opposite spectrum, campaign groups like Care Not Killing promotes more and better palliative care, which is basically the provision of medication to alleviate pain as an alternative to assisted suicide, and supports the current law as it stands, which means the assisted suicide prohibition under the Suicide Act. In the past few years, there have been a number of attempts to change the law. Back in 2014, 645, the Assisted Dying for the Terminally Ill Bill aimed to enable a competent adult who was suffering unbearable as a result of a terminal illness to receive medical assistance to die at his own following considered persistent requests. The bill was voted down in the House of Lords in 2006. Earlier on, in 2008-9, there was the two amendments proposing the Coroners Justice Bill, which also failed. And tonight we're talking about the latest attempt to change the law, which is the Assisted Dying Bill 2003, 2013, 2014, which was introduced to the House of Lords last year on the 15th of May 2013, and aims to enable competent adults who are terminally ill to be provided at their request with specific assistance to end their life. And at this point, before I turn to our speakers, it would be interesting at this point to see how many people support legalization of assisted suicide. So by show of hands, please, those of you supporting assisted suicide. Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. So I will now turn to our two speakers who will talk about the bill in detail. And each speaker will talk about 20 minutes. You have 2 minutes notice before the end, and then they'll be happy to take questions. So to begin with, I'm very happy to present Mr. Greg Judge of Dignity in Dying. Greg joined Dignity in Dying team in 2013 with the task of coordinating the Disabled Activists for Dignity in Dying, a campaign group for disabled people led by disabled people. Greg is a graduate of University of Bristol and has been active in party politics and charity governance. He currently works part-time as a political assistant for a member of the House of Lords. Both Disabled Activists for Dignity in Dying and Dignity in Dying campaign for a change in the law that allows terminally ill, mentally competent adults the choice of an assisted death. The current law sees terminally ill people who feel their suffering is too much put in an impossible position, from attempting suicide in the UK to travelling abroad much earlier than they would prefer while still having the physical strength. With Lord Falconer, Lord Chancellor under New Labour's government, having tabled his assisted dying bill, Dignity in Dying is supporting the proposed law and the strict upfront safeguards that form a central part of the bill. Some of these safeguards include eligibility of choice only for terminally people with less than 6 months to live, as well as assessment agreement of 2 independent doctors. 80% of the public support assisted dying for terminally ill people, and 79% of disabled people surveyed also support the new law, confident of their own safety, as the bill does not legalize assisted dying for the people who are not dying, disabled or not. So Mr. Judge will present the case in favour of the bill.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you for ELSA for inviting me to speak on behalf of the bill this evening. To make the case for changing the law, first of all, we need to look foremost at the definitions of what we're working with. For example, assisted dying is when a terminally ill, mentally competent adult is making the choice of their own free will, and after meeting strict legal safeguards, takes prescribed medicine which will end their life. This is not to be confused with assisted suicide, for example, which is where a chronically ill or disabled person who is not terminally ill can be given help to end their lives. Or, for that matter, voluntary euthanasia, which is where a terminally ill adult, or sometimes chronically ill or disabled, can have their lives ended by a doctor. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about the case for, and also touch on some points about the case against change. The current law I propose is a complete mess. The Suicide Act, passed in 1961, is now over 50 years old and is out of step with public opinion and our current morals and values in a 21st century society. Used fully, still, can be punishable with up to 14 years in prison. The current law forces terminally ill people to seek out alternatives to exercise their control of their own free will. Now, before I go into the predicaments the current law gives to terminally ill people, I would just like to highlight, which I did mention to Natalie a few moments ago, the title of tonight, which is Dignity versus Care. Obviously, it's something to get us started with, to debate the topic, but in actual fact, dignity versus care is a false proposition, because they're not in conflict. Legal assisted dying, practiced properly, complements palliative care. It encourages wider discussion about the end of life and increases investment in end-of-life care, which has been evidenced in the state of Oregon. It actually enables people to think more about end-of-life options, and having good palliative care is important. It's one of the cornerstones of end-of-life care, and I think in the mainstream in this debate, many people celebrate it rightly. However, for some people, good quality palliative care cannot address their concerns about losing autonomy, control and dignity at the end of their lives. Assisted dying, first and foremost, is not about pain management. Good quality palliative care can effectively manage pain, and dignity in dying fully supports that. Assisted dying is about providing all practically available choices to terminally ill people who feel their suffering has become unbearable. I'd like to go back now we've covered that, to individuals taking their matters into their own hands, because the current law is working. As you mentioned, Dignitas in Switzerland is quite a famous clinic, which we see semi-regularly come up in the news cycle. However, as an option for some terminally ill people, it is first and foremost quite an expensive option in terms of having to travel to Switzerland. Your personal health that you need whilst also struggling with a terminal illness has to be to a good enough standard to be able to travel that length of journey. And then you have the personal fear of the consequences for your loved ones in how they're going to, what they're going to face in terms of prosecution once they return to the UK potentially. And obviously you're ultimately being forced to die in a foreign country where your surroundings are alien, you're dealing with people from a different health service, not the one you're normally used to. Moving on, another consequence of the current law is mercy killings. Now, obviously this is a direct consequence of the Suicide Act and the criminal prosecutions, the criminal points that are based within the bill. It's all well and good talking about points about, what are the consequences, but when it comes to the ill people, it has a full-on effect on people's lives. For example, there is, and this is just one person of many that have faced the consequences of the Suicide Act. We have Heather Platten. This woman, now in her 60s and facing terminal cancer herself, did have a son called Nigel who had Huntington's disease. On his 42nd birthday, he phoned up his mom and said the best present she could give him would be to end his life. After taking drugs, which he sourced himself, she took the choice to use a pillow over his face while he lost consciousness. Initially, she was bailed for murder, later charged with aiding and abetting suicide, and received a conditional discharge for 1 year. In the same situation, Nigel initially tried to starve himself and drank vodka whilst away in Scotland for 6 weeks. This is another side effect of the current law, which is people taking violent suicides and extreme attempts at suicide, which don't always work. They're left in situations where they are lonely, maybe taking a course of action by themselves without any support, and ultimately, if the attempt goes wrong, they can be left worse off in the short term whilst they're fighting the effects of the terminal illness. Authorities in Oregon, the state where assisted dying has been passed, are aware of 94 terminally ill people who have been prevented from violent suicide through assisted dying, the choice being available to them. Lastly, in terms of individuals taking matters into their own hands, we have refusal of food and water. Often this results in a long and protracted death, rather than an immediate death that the person may prefer. All of these consequences and people taking actions into their own hands creates a zeitgeist within end-of-life care of underground practices. Research of all deaths in the UK in 2004 found that 0.16% was cases of doctors ending life following an explicit request from the patient, also known as voluntary euthanasia. Assisted dying already takes place underground without any safeguards, and this particularly puts vulnerable people at risk with that, because there is a lack of transparency about what is occurring. In February 2010, I'm not sure whether you mentioned this, Natalie, the Director of Public Prosecutions issued the latest prosecuting policy on assisted suicide. Ultimately, it leaves it in the hands of the dying person and possibly friends and family. That fundamental point is not altered. It is still a crime, with prosecution of either murder or manslaughter still possible, and most importantly, in my opinion, investigations take place post-mortem and not whilst the person is still alive and can speak for themselves about their own wishes and who is being involved in their end-of-life care. Coming on to the bill, the safeguards that are built into the bill are the key cornerstone of why the bill will be able to provide a safe environment for terminally ill people who want the choice of an assisted suicide. The safeguards are built upon those used in the Dying with Dignity Act, which is the law in Oregon which passed assisted dying in 1997. In order to receive medical help to die under the assisted dying bill, a person would have to be terminally ill with 6 months or less to live, be mentally competent, and have made a clear and settled intention to end their own life, which is persistent, well-informed, and voluntary. Other key safeguards include the assessment by 2 independent doctors to establish the request being well-informed, persistent, and voluntary, referral if there is suspicion of mental competency to a specialist, and that they be fully informed about all the palliative care options available to them. Presumably, up to this point of thinking or considering assisted dying, the terminally ill person would have pursued good quality palliative care, and this should be continued right up to whenever they make a decision if they feel it's the best option for them. The patient's request also has to be independently witnessed, and for most, depending upon how terminal their condition is, whether we're talking days or weeks or months, there's a standard waiting period of 14 days between the patient requesting an assisted death and any action being undertaken. The last safeguard, and the most important one, is that any life-ending medication has to be self-administered by the patient themselves. it is not to be done by a doctor, a nurse, a family friend, or any independent third party. It is the patient themselves who actually enacts the last life-ending action that takes their own life away. Patients can also orally revoke the request at any point, right at the last minute, if they feel it's not for them. Who would the assisted dying bill not apply to? It would not apply to people with non-terminal illnesses. So if you're not dying and you have more than 6 months to live, it would not apply to you. People with disabilities who are not terminally ill, they would fall outside this category, understandably. Those who are not mentally competent, whether you've been found to be not mentally competent straight away because of your records, or a specialist has decided you're not mentally competent, you'd fall out of the eligibility criteria. Those with dementia and Alzheimer's, they would not be eligible, and anyone under 18 would not be eligible either. Public opinion, which in terms of enacting a law and passing it through either the House of Lords and going forward the House of Commons, first and foremost has to have public opinion behind it in order to put politicians in a position of enacting on the people's will. The general public, throughout many polls, but initially one of the latest ones was in 2010 with the British Sexual Attitudes Survey. They found 82% of the general public agreed that a doctor should probably or definitely be allowed to end the life of a patient with a painful, incurable disease at the patient's request. In terms of the percentage of support, obviously polls change from time to time, but they generally exist in the region of support between 70 and 80%. And this is usually translated in that 3 out of 4 voters support assisted dying to be legalised. In terms of specialist groups, which have a particular ownership of the issue and a specialist interest, people with religious beliefs, a 2013 survey by YouGov found that 78% of those who attended a place of worship at least once a month supported assisted dying. And disabled people in particular, which as the coordinator of disabled activists for dignity in dying is one of the areas that I'm working on, we ran a YouGov poll independently audited by them in 2013, which found that 79% of disabled people supported a change in the law for terminally ill people. And importantly, when asked did they support a change in the law for assisted suicide that would apply to them, the level of support dropped dramatically, as it has done with previous polls as well. Health professionals, another important area. There was a survey run by the medical magazine Pulse in November 2013, and they found that their level of support ranged at 31%. This is in line with other polls taken of health professionals as well. What this represents is that there is a steady population of healthcare professionals who will be willing to undertake and aid an assisted death. But obviously, this is not to administer a life-ending medication, because that's the patient's responsibility to do that. In terms of some of the fears which have been highlighted by concerned individuals, the slippery slope is one which is constantly talked about, and that is the proposition that if you were to pass assisted dying for terminally ill people, you'd soon have assisted suicide for disabled people, and even potentially euthanasia without personal consent. In terms of evidence to overcome this, the US state of Oregon passed its Death with Dignity Act in 1997, over 15 years ago. And over that 15-year period, the calls for a widening of the law have not occurred, and there has been no sustained campaign within the state to go beyond assisted dying and to give the choice to a greater number of people. Overall, assisted dying is a pursuit to give additional choice and the maximum opportunity for dying people, and only dying people, to have another option in their range of end-of-life care. Palliative care, good quality palliative care, is of utmost importance, and as having a legalised assisted dying option within a state and a country enables better quality palliative care to be pursued. In terms of numbers that would take up this option, in the US state of Oregon, we have numbers range about 70 people a year take up an assisted death. And that number has stayed constant over several years. Just to finish with the slippery slope argument, in terms of the law that you enact, it is the law you enact is the law you get. One of the arguments that is brought up on a regular basis is Belgium and the Netherlands and the Benelux countries. But if you actually examine the laws they put in place in 2002, I believe, and previous to that, they were initially, first and foremost, wider laws. They encapsulated the eligibility criteria into more conditions and non-dying people, unlike the law that we are proposing. So if you start with a more tightly eligible criteria for a law, that, as evidence has shown between different groups of countries, is what you will stay within throughout the course of the life of the bill. And I believe that is me done. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Now turning to our second speaker. Peter has served as campaign director of the Care Not Killing Alliance since its inception, I believe in 2006. Having previously worked for many years as a general surgeon and more recently acting as CEO for the Christian Medical Fellowship. Care Not Killing brings together healthcare professionals, disability rights groups, faith-based organizations, and thousands of individuals with the aims of promoting better and more palliative care, ensuring that existing laws against euthanasia and assisted suicide are not weakened or repealed, and influencing the balance of public opinion against any further weakening of the law. Assisted suicide and euthanasia are opposed by the major medical professional bodies and disability rights organizations who with Care Not Killing have seen the devastating effects of such practices abroad. Euthanasia and assisted suicide encourage devaluing of vulnerable people, prejudice towards them, and discriminatory attitudes within the medical profession. Care Not Killing opposed the 2006 Lord's Bill, which was considered as a first step. Care Not Killing opposed the 2009 Falconer Amendment to the Corners and Justice Bill, as I mentioned before, which was characterized as the abandonment of hope. And Care Not Killing will continue to oppose the Canon Lord's Bill, which Lord Falconer has said will place doctors above the law. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Saunders for Care Not Killing.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and thank you for coming along, and thanks, Greg, for that. This debate is not actually about whether we might have sympathy with people who want to end their lives, or with those who might want to help them. The debate's actually about whether a specific piece of legislation, the Assisted Dying Bill of Lord Falconer, should become law. That's the issue we're looking at. And I want to argue that for three main reasons it shouldn't. First of all, it's discriminatory, and a discriminatory piece of legislation will not work. Secondly, it's dangerous, And then thirdly, this piece of legislation is unnecessary. The 40 member organisations which make up the Care Not Killing Alliance believe that the law should not be changed. And the four main groups in the UK who are resisting the change in the law might interest you. The first one is doctors. Every single doctors' organisation in Britain, virtually that has an opinion, is, with one or two exceptions who are neutral, is opposed to a change in the law. The British Medical Association, the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Physicians, the Association for Palliative Medicine, the British Geriatric Society, and the World Medical Association are all opposed to a change in the law. Greg is a disabled person, and he's given his view tonight, but every disability rights organisation in Britain is opposed to a change in the law. That includes Not Dead Yet UK, the Disability Rights UK, Scope, the United Kingdom Disabled People's Council, and the two leading spokespeople for on this issue in the House of Lords, Baroness Jane Campbell and Tanny Gray-Thompson, the para-Olympian, both strongly opposed to any change. Faith groups you would expect are opposed, and parliamentarians have been opposed, as we've heard already. And all of these groups are opposed primarily because they're anxious about the consequences of licensing doctors to dispense lethal drugs. They're worried about the safety issues of it. Now, bills and amendments advocating assisted suicide, as it's been said, with a variety of provisions and safeguards, have already been rejected 3 times by British parliaments since 2006. We had the Joffrey Bill in 2006, the amendment to the Coroners and Justice Bill, also by Lord Falconer in 2009, and what hasn't been mentioned is Margaret MacDonald's Scottish Bill, which was defeated by a massive majority of 85 to 16 back in December 2010, all about public safety. So first let's look at the issue of discrimination. Lord Falconer wants to legalise assisted suicide for mentally competent adults with less than 6 months to live. The bill, in other words, grants a legal right to prescribe lethal drugs to some people, but not to others. And if you listen to Falconer talk about his bill, he gives 2 main arguments for it. The first one is compassion, and the second one is autonomy or choice. But there is, I would suggest to you, a logical disconnect between these arguments and what he's pushing for. And that's because those who might desire assisted suicide are not at all contiguous with mentally competent, terminally ill adults. In fact, the overwhelming vast majority of people who are mentally competent adults with less than 6 months to live do not want assisted suicide. Less than 3% even talk about it, and the average palliative medicine specialist will tell you that in 20,000 lifetime cases, they could count less than 10 who had persistent ongoing requests. On the other hand, there are some people who are not mentally competent, terminally ill adults, who desperately wish to die. People like Tony Nicholson, who had Lipton syndrome, Debbie Purdy with multiple sclerosis, Daniel James, who we've already heard about with tetraplegia. But they can't under this bill because they're not terminally ill. People with dementia or mental illness who might have wanted it when they were competent but are no longer competent don't qualify. Teenagers who are less than 18 who maybe are terminally ill and suffering but they're not adults. So you see there's a disconnect between the arguments of autonomy and compassion which are used and the change that this bill is looking for. It is at heart discriminatory. And the problem with discriminatory pieces of legislation is that they do not stand. And this is why Lord Joffrey, I think, Falconer's House of Lords colleague, described his very, very similar bill in 2006 as a first step. Change the principle and then bring the hard cases. And whilst Lord Falconer and Dignity in Dying, and I'm not in any way suggesting that Greg has a bigger agenda here, they may claim to have very limited objectives, but on their coattails are a whole host of other organisations in Britain with much broader and more radical agendas. Friends at the End, Society for Old Age Rational Suicide, the British Humanist Association, National Secular Society, Exit International, who will not be satisfied with the so-called modest changes that Falconer is seeking, but they're using exactly the same arguments to push for to advance their case, and they're able to do this because Lord Falconer's position is at heart, as I've said, both illogical and also discriminatory. If adults can have it, then why can't children who are judged to be guilt competent? If competent people can have it, then what about those with dementia who, it's argued, would have wanted it if they'd been able to say? If people who are terminally ill, what about those who are chronically ill or disabled who are suffering unbearably? If for those with physical suffering, why not those with mental suffering who are tormented by being alive, by their situation? Or as Exit International has said, why not the elderly bereaved person or the troubled teenager? Why shouldn't they be equally deserving? And the problem is that any law allowing assisted suicide or euthanasia, and assisted dying is basically assisted suicide for those with a limited life expectancy, any bill like this will carry within it the seeds of its own extension, because once you create a right, there will inevitably be pressure to extend the boundaries, which may well not survive legal challenge once the so-called right is available to some. It won't stand up against equality legislation. Slippery slope, I think, is the wrong term to apply to this phenomenon, because it describes a kind of passive slip. But the kind of process that we will observe will be one of intentional mission creep or incremental extension. The moment the ink is dry on the Act, we'll see deserving cases who fall outside its bounds, but who appear to be far more deserving than many of those within its bounds, and the bill will be ripe for challenge. Which brings me to my second point: this bill is dangerous. Past bills like Falconer's have been rejected on grounds of concerns about public safety, as I've said, and the concerns by those in opposition were both about how such a system could be regulated, but also about that any change in the law to allow assisted suicide, euthanasia, for any group of people whatsoever would place pressure on vulnerable people to end their lives for fear of being a financial or emotional or care burden upon loved ones or on a society that's short of resources. Pressure that's intensely felt at a time of economic recession, when care budgets are being slashed and many families are under pressure. But also, when you change a law like this, three things happen. The first is that people begin to practice up to the boundaries of the new law. The second is that some will overstep that law. And the third, and perhaps the most significant, is that public conscience will change, so that what people initially found unacceptable will then become acceptable. Changing the law would also give doctors a degree of power over life and death that some will inevitably abuse. It will be doctors who see the patients, fill out the forms, dispense the lethal drugs. Some of them will push the boundaries. Some of them will falsify certification. There may be some, like Harold Shipman, who will develop a taste for killing and who will be very, very difficult to detect. But many of them will be simply too busy, too pressured, facing too many demands to make the kind of cool, comprehensive and objective assessments that this kind of law requires, and there's no requirement for the doctor actually to know the patient or their background in this bill. We have over recent months seen how in a cash-strapped, target-driven NHS it can be very difficult to regulate bad practice. Winterbourne View, North Staffordshire NHS Trust. The Liverpool Care Pathway, a perfectly good therapeutic tool, but in the wrong hands can be a very dangerous thing indeed. But the obvious parallel is actually abortion. Now, I'm not, we have a variety of views about abortion, I'm sure, and that's not my point. The point is that the Abortion Act is a very, very similar piece of legislation to what Falconer is proposing. 2 doctors give a signature, create certification. We began in 1967 with the Abortion Act with a very strict law which allowed abortion only in very limited circumstances. And that law has not changed in the last 45 years. But now there are 200,000 abortions a year. Most of them fall outside the boundaries of the law. There's illegal pre-signing of forms, abortion for sex selection, abortion on demand for spurious mental health reasons, and only 1 conviction for abortion in 45 years. With 7.5 million, probably 98% of which have actually been outside the letter of the law. And my point is that society is reluctant to touch and question doctors. The police are reluctant to investigate. The DPP hesitates to prosecute. The courts are unwilling to convict. Parliament turns a blind eye. It is simply not safe to give doctors this sort of power because there will be a small number who will abuse it, and it will be very, very difficult to stop them. In a recent interview for Pulse magazine, which is a magazine for GPs, Lord Falconer was asked if GPs were likely to get into trouble with the police for authorising assisted suicide under his proposed bill. And he said that the bill would make it very difficult for GPs to face any proceedings in court, as long as it was their genuine view that it was the patient's position. So in other words, it's left up to the doctor in good faith, exactly the same wording we see in the Abortion Act. In other words, it's not necessary for the patient to be mentally competent, terminally ill, or even 18 years old, or with a settled view to end his or her life. All that's required is for the doctor to say that it is his or her genuine view that these conditions apply, and to tick a box and put a signature on a piece of paper, just as what happens presently with the Abortion Act. Now, Falconer's draft bill has already attracted very serious criticism because of its paper-thin safeguards. The huge difficulties, just to look at some of them, very difficult to tell if someone's got 6 months to live. I've looked after many dying patients. You can tell within days, possibly a week or so, but once you get into months, you can be years out. Very difficult to assess mental capacity. Very difficult to assess a clear and settled wish if you don't know the patient, to know what sort of coercion is going on within the family. As I said, doctors don't need to know the patient. There's no psychiatric assessment involved to see if they're properly depressed. There's nothing about approved premises like there is even in the Abortion Act. So this could happen in one hospital bed where someone's having palliative care in the very next one. There's very little detail on the declaration form. And in fact, the whole reporting and oversight procedures in this bill aren't even in the bill. They're delegated after the bill is passed to the Secretary of State and the Chief Medical Officer to do it. And my concerns are heightened by the evidence of incremental extension and mission creep in other jurisdictions, where various forms of legalised dispensing of lethal drugs has been made possible. Let's look at some examples. In the Netherlands, which legalised assisted suicide and euthanasia in 2002, there's been an increase of 10 to 20% of cases per year since 2006. The 2012 figures included 42 with early dementia and 13 with psychiatric conditions. In addition, about 5.6% of all deaths in the Netherlands were related to deep continuous sedation in 2001. This rose to 8% in 2005, 12% in 2010. The significant proportion of these deaths involved doctors deeply sedating patients and then withholding fluids with explicit intention that they'll die. Children as young as 12 can have euthanasia in the Netherlands. And a New England Medical Journal report was on 22 babies with spina bifida and hydrocephalus who were killed by lethal injection in the Netherlands over a 7-year period. It estimated there were 15 to 20 per year like this. All illegal, but it happens. You don't have to, once you've allowed it in some cases, practice migrates. That's the point. In Belgium, which legalised euthanasia in 2002, there's been a 500% increase in deaths over 10 years between 2003 and 2012. High-profile cases include Mark and Eddie Verbessen, the 45-year-old twins, deaf identical twins who were euthanased by the Belgian state after their eyesight began to fail. Then there was Nancy Verhelst, whose life was ended in front of TV cameras after a series of botched sex change operations, which made her depressed. And then there's Anne G, who had anorexia and who adopted to end her life after being sexually abused by the psychiatrist who was supposed to be treating her for her life-threatening condition. Organ donation euthanasia is already practiced in Belgium, and Belgium just legalised euthanasia for children with terminal illnesses last month. Already in parts of Belgium, 1 in 3 cases of euthanasia is involuntary, without consent, even though that is illegal. Half go unreported, based on doctors' surveys. There hasn't been, however, in 8,000 cases, 1 prosecution for abuses. Not one. And perhaps not surprising, because one of the lead euthanasia practitioners, Dr. Distelmans, chairs the very committee that's meant to regulate his own activity. In Switzerland, where assisted suicide is legal, first released statistics in 2009 showing a 700% rise in the previous 10 years of cases. Amongst those travelling from abroad to end their lives at Dignitas include people who could have lived for decades, ending their lives with arthritis, blindness, spinal injury, diabetes, mental illness, or people who were essentially well but could not bear to live without their spouses. Oregon. There has been actually a 350% increase in cases since legalisation. According to a BMJ study, 1 in 6 was depressed, and yet fewer than 1 in 20 had a psychiatric assessment. Last year, as in previous years, the 3 most frequently mentioned end-of-life concerns were loss of autonomy, 93%, decreasing ability to participate in activities that made life enjoyable, 88%, and loss of dignity, 73%. It's not about pain, it's not about suffering. You see, what we have here is essentially a medical solution for what is an existential problem. Finally, the bill's unnecessary. Requests for euthanasia are extremely rare if people are looked after properly. And the present law, I think, far from being a shambles, is clear and right and does not need changing. On the one hand, the penalties it holds in reserve, which are virtually never ever used, act as a very strong deterrent to exploitation and abuse. Which is why, even though we have 500,000 deaths a year in this country from all causes, we only see 15 to 20 people per year, just a trickle going to Dignitas. The best system available is that we have currently. A law carrying a blanket prohibition on both assisted suicide and euthanasia, but giving discretion both to prosecutors and to judges to temper justice with mercy in hard cases. So when there is a case, and they're extremely rare, the police investigate, the DPP looks at it, and he's got to decide firstly, is there enough evidence to bring a prosecution, and is it in the public interest to do so? In the last 5 years there have been 91 cases, only one of them has led to a conviction. The person certainly didn't go to prison for 14 years. So the present law and system is merciful and compassionate to hard cases, but it still acts as an extremely strong deterrent to exploitation and abuse. It doesn't need changing, as we'd say in surgery. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Thank you.
take you first. So we'll now take questions for our two speakers. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So after the questions, we'll take another vote. So for now, any questions? Yeah, and also just so you know, we're audio recording the event, so everyone who wishes to have a copy or something, it will be uploaded somewhere. I'm not sure where yet, but it will be. So, any questions?
This is to you, Greg.
Okay.
I quite like the argument that you can't really trust doctors to, follow the rules, and it was the same thing with heroin substitute. They started giving them out sort of without any real kind of idea of what they were doing. What's your argument against that, if you have one, or do you agree with it?
Well, within the bill, there has to be 2 independent doctors that have to look at the request and establish that it is a right and reasoned request. So any suggestion that you're going to have a single doctor going off on their own pursuit, Harold Shipman style, it just wouldn't be able to happen. For example, for any conspiracy to take place, you'd have to have the agreements of 2 doctors with their careers at stake, nurses, other professionals around the treatment process, because it can't just be provided by just 2 professionals. There's a group of people involved. You then got the independent witness. That is to be independent of the family, friends, and the clinical treatment team. So there's a growing. It's not just some sort of underground, non-transparent process which can just happen at the whim of one person. You're gradually having a growing amount of people. Obviously, the transfers to the argument is that that just brings bureaucracy. Things take a long time. But the process is streamlined enough to enable a choice to happen within several weeks, providing they meet the criteria. But in terms of having, one single person or even 2 people going off on their own deadly pursuits, that wouldn't happen.
Can I respond to that? I disagree with that. I think it's very difficult to regulate. I think as British people, we're not good at regulating things. Look at the banking crisis. Look at North Staffordshire. Look at the Liverpool Care Boat. Look at the things I mentioned. And look at the Abortion Act. That requires 2 doctors in good faith signing a form and a whole lot of other people plus an infrastructure. And what happens, what you've got already is that you do have a small number of doctors in this country who are hugely committed to seeing this kind of system come in. They will push the boundaries, they won't see the patients, they'll sign the forms, and it will be virtually impossible. We don't even know how it's going to be regulated yet. It's not even in the bill. But it will happen after the event. And because something is on a form and documented, it doesn't mean it's happened that way. And so when Greg says, what you legislate is what you get, I disagree with that. I think if you've got a blanket prohibition on all assisted suicide, it's much, much easier to police and control. And it puts it puts a lot of fear into people in pushing the boundaries. It means there's far less exploitation and abuse. But once you create the facility, there will be people who push those boundaries. Don't trust me. You can't trust doctors. Trust me, I'm a doctor.
So, building on what you said, like, don't trust the law that you enact, basically, how would you respond to the current law and the way it actually works? The current law prohibits assisted suicide, but as you said, it doesn't. Every law doesn't really work. But how do you respond to that in terms of assisted dying?
Well, I think the very laws are a bit like countries. That it's far easily to defend them if their boundaries fall upon natural boundaries. Now, it's easier to defend a country where the national boundary follows rivers and mountain ranges and that kind of stuff. And the best sort of laws are those that give blanket prohibitions but provide some degree of mercy, compassion and flexibility. I mean, for example, we wouldn't countenance a law which says the speed limit on the motorway is 70 miles per hour, but if your child's sick or you're really late for an appointment or you feel incredibly stressed, you can drive at 120. We wouldn't have that. No, we say the law's 70. But if there is a case, yes, of course, and it's a sick, dying child being taken, no one's going to prosecute that sort of case. But it's far better to give that discretion to a person, a director of public prosecution or a judge, than actually to try and create a really misshapen law which breaks the fundamental principle and which will then be impossible to regulate. I appeal to you as lawyers.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that quickly?
Yeah.
In terms of dividing lines, obviously Peter's advocating this, the dividing line between suicide and natural death. But you've also got the dividing line portrayed in the bill between living and dying. That is a natural dividing line between from say a point in the future, a group of people continuing to live, and a group of people who are going to be facing an inevitable death. Within British law, we already have dividing lines that we work by. For example, on the abortion law, we have the dividing line of, I think, about 24 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. That line between when you take Plan A or you take Plan B, we're already in a system by which we are advocating, petitioning decisions and deciding that there are boundaries between one course of action and the other. So if by means of saying you disagree with laws that have boundaries and that split up criteria, then we've got a lot of laws to undo. Then we're not going to go through that process.
I think no law that's discriminatory will survive, because all it would take is someone to bring along the hard case that falls outside the boundary and they say it's not fair. But in the process of passing this law, you may be giving a liberty to a very, very small percentage of terminally ill people, but at the very same time you'll be removing legal protection from the overwhelming majority of people who are mentally competent and terminally ill, and that's, I would suggest, very dangerous indeed. But because there are people who have an interest, financial or emotional, in another person's death, and the things that happen within families and societies can be very, very subtle indeed.
When we talk about laws and exceptions, building on what you said about the laws and exceptions, I am aware that the background of the bill was through the Commission on Assisted Dying by Lord Falconer again. Based on what you said about discretion, the cases that do not fall under the bill will fall under the discretion of the DPP under the current law. Is that right? So you both mentioned how specific the bill is. So in the cases not falling under those specific criteria that you both mentioned will fall under that discretion.
Well, no, I think that discretion works well where you've got a blanket prohibition.
Yeah.
When you don't, and it's just two doctors' signatures in good faith, and that all that's happening is there's some regulatory authority that hasn't even been decided on yet, which is collecting this paper and filing it, then you've lost all of that powerful disincentive to breaking the law. And we work a lot with disabled people, and I know Jane Campbell, Baroness Jane Campbell, who's profoundly disabled and is strongly opposed to this law, is always saying there are a lot of people out there who think that my life is not worth living, and this law is there to protect me against them, and also to protect others from having to help me and being coerced to do so.
I'll answer that later, but yeah, carry on.
Given that there's been over a decade of experience in countries where we've had legal euthanasia. What has been the public reaction to this, and also the health professional reaction to this in Belgium and Oregon? And is there any kind of concerted campaign to expand the rights or to retract what's already been legislated for?
Absolutely. There's a court case going on in Belgium now against Distelmans, who chairs the committee. And it's been brought by a young man called Tom Mortier, 37-year-old university lecturer. And Tom's mother was killed by Distelmans with a lethal injection, with her consent, because she was depressed. And the first he knew about it was when he was contacted a day later to be asked to come and pick up her personal effects. No one else in the family was told. And the difficulty, when we first met him, he said the difficulty we have is that we cannot get anything into the media in this country, or any interest. But what we saw when child euthanasia was legalised is that we saw a real rise of opposition. 200 doctors signing a letter asking for it not. A lot of international reaction. And I do a lot of media on this stuff, and I would say, up until fairly recently, we've been the kind of bad guys. But, go into a Radio 4 interview and I'm told by two of them, goodness, we're really worried about what's happening in Belgium now. So there is, we have sister organisations in Belgium and the Netherlands and so on, and I can tell you, and in Oregon and in Washington, where it's also being legalised, Washington State. And there is a lot of real concern, a lot of individual cases that are causing problems. Barbara Wagner, Oregon, had cancer, wanted cancer drugs, chemotherapy, got a letter from the Oregon Health Authority which said, we can't afford your cancer drugs, but we can offer you assisted suicide. She said, well, I didn't ask for that. Randy Scoop, another guy, got the same letter. Jeanette Hall, another one who was all lined up for assisted suicide, talked out of it by a doctor, and she's still alive 12 years later.
Is that a part of Medicaid?
Delighted. Sorry?
Is that a part of Medicaid or Medicare?
Well, I think the problem is that once you legalise assisted suicide, what it does is that it makes assisted suicide a treatment option. Once you've got a treatment option, it has to be costed. And health departments think about how many of this treatment option, So for the cancer patient, you've got chemotherapy, palliative care, or assisted suicide. This costs thousands of pounds, this is hundreds of pounds, this is £5. Now, do you want to put that kind of temptation in front of relatives who might be hard up, of people, or of health officials, health secretaries?
So at the moment, the state-run Medicare or the federal Medicare, they have the option to use euthanasia as a treatment option, or is it only for private individuals to use with their health insurance in the States? Do you know? I know it's quite a specific question.
Well, it's a different. With a private-based system, there's more financial incentive in giving people, expensive treatments, you might argue. But in a public system, I think we could see quite different pressures in operation. And this is why I think that making comparisons between one tiny northwest US state with a minuscule population and a sovereign state like Britain with a collapsing health service under great financial pressure is very dangerous indeed. There are, as I've said, real problems in Oregon. But if we want to see what happens in countries which go down this route, then we need to look across the North Sea to what's happening in the Netherlands and Belgium.
Sorry, thank you. In terms of the geography of countries that have legalised, assisted dying, assisted suicide, and euthanasia, I suppose at the initial look, it's helpful to see the UK and the Benelux countries, Belgium and Netherlands, as an obvious comparison to make because they're next door to each other. But in terms of in terms of public support and looking at the public mandate that's being offered to parliamentarians in these countries, there is a comparison and a consensus to be made between the US states and the UK, more so than there is between the UK and Belgium, for example. With Belgium and the Netherlands, their laws in the early 2000s were set out with a wider criteria, with the aim, the legislative aim of those laws was always intended to be wider. When asked in the UK whether we would agree as a public with those type of laws, we've consistently said we don't. With assisted suicide, for example, it's always polled much lower than assisted dying, and that's been over a trend of well over 5 years, if not more. Consistently, we've said that in cases of terminally ill people with less than 6 months to live, for example, the British public would support that within strict upfront safeguards. But when we actually move and say, but what about people with dementia? What about people with disabilities? Consistently, whether you are disabled or whether you're able-bodied and a member of the general public, we've consistently said, no, we don't support that. And that is in line with the trends coming out of Oregon. And another reason why we've built this proposed law upon the Dying with Dignity Act in Oregon.
I was on Channel 5 television the other week debating with Baroness Warnock, member of the House of Lords, who thinks that the law should be changed to allow euthanasia for people with dementia. Okay? She says when you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. Now that interview was accompanied by a survey which was carried out beforehand by Channel 5, which showed that the majority of people in Britain believed that euthanasia should be made legal for people with dementia. Now that absolutely horrifies me, but it, having had a father die from dementia and seeing how incredibly vulnerable he was, but it does show us how public opinion changes and how easily manipulated it is by hard cases. And I think it reminds us that when parliamentarians make laws, they simply shouldn't be stamping into law every public opinion. On that basis, we'd have the death penalty back in Britain. So we trust our leaders to make these decisions. And as I say, when you look at disabled people's leaders, doctors' leaders, and parliamentarians looking at this in great detail, it's been consistently no. And these are not people who have necessarily a moral objection, who wouldn't have sympathy with the hard cases, but they're saying you can't regulate the system, you can't make it safe. Best to have the system we've got now.
Can I quickly respond? Thank you. Just in terms of disabled leaders and health leaders, I know obviously, as you're aware, Peter, it was the Royal College for GPs, wasn't it, recently, that finished their consultation on assisted dying.
Sure, yeah.
And the results that came out within their paper was that a large percentage of GPs were against assisted dying. But actually, when you look at the results in detail, it's a large percentage of GPs that responded, and the response numbers were in the hundreds out of a total membership of the Royal College of thousands, tens of thousands. And equally with disabled leaders, obviously, Jane Campbell, Tanny Gray Thompson, representatives of Scope, they all have genuine concerns, which even I've had as I've haven't read enough detail and as I've gone into it and learnt more. But actually, when you ask these people, who say they're representing disabled people, have you asked grassroots people with disabilities what their opinions are on assisted dying? How have they developed their position on this policy? You quickly find that it's either based just on internal policy work through a small group of people in an office, and they're not actually going out and talking to everyday disabled people. and that's what I'm doing with Disabled Activists for Dignity in Dying. Each day I'm talking to more disabled people and volunteers on our team are, and we're finding that yes, some people have still have these genuine concerns and they say no, don't want to change. But when you actually start finding more and more people that is being supported by polls with the British Attitude Survey, independent polls by YouGov last year, it's showing that yes, there is a awareness initially, and there is in the general public. But when you start, talking about the fact that they have to be mentally competent, they're terminally ill with less than 6 months to live, these aren't just, arbitrary, guidelines that you can just, write a letter off, as you say, Peter, and just hope it, happens at a doctor's wish. They're strict guidelines, they're safeguards that you either apply to the safeguards or you don't apply to it. You either have the option or you don't have the option. There's no opportunity to bend the rules.
This bill doesn't even apply to disabled people, so why should they, why should their opinion, even if it's justified on this? This applies to people who are mentally competent adults with less than 6 months to live, initially. So, and I can tell you that the Association for Palliative Medicine, that has far more experience, and it's 800 members who look after dying people in this country and understand, first of all, how they think and how they tick and how vulnerable they are, but most importantly, what you can do for them with good palliative care and how they change their minds once they experience it, I think should be listened to. And as I said earlier, the overwhelming vast majority of people, once they experience good care, don't want this.
Who was first?
Mr. Saunders, you said that currently the blanket ban is fine as it is, but we know that hasn't prevented UK citizens from actually travelling to Europe to die with dignity. We also know that the Crown Prosecution Service prosecutes very rarely. Do you think that what we've done is just outsourced the issue, and instead of actually helping to solve, what we've done is we've created an extra hurdle on the way for those who want the option to die with dignity?
I think that's a good question, but the evidence that the law is working is that the numbers are very, very small. Now, a law against murder doesn't stop some murders happening. A law against stealing doesn't stop. A law against assault doesn't stop assaults, or a law against arson doesn't stop people lighting fires. You'll always get people breaking the laws. But I don't really understand the argument that says, given that some people are breaking the laws, why don't we just change the laws so that, because obviously there's a demand, there's some really desperate people who are wanting to do these things. I mean, there are some people who really desperately want to, this is perhaps a strange example, but there are some people who desperately want to throw a brick through other people's windows. But the fact that there is a law that means that you could be prosecuted and go to prison for doing such a thing makes the overwhelming majority of people think twice. And what I'm saying is that laws can't change human hearts or human behaviour, but laws are a very powerful disincentive to exploitation and abuse. And the evidence that the current law is working is the very, very low numbers that we're seeing of people who are taking desperate means. What I'm saying is if the law changed, then that would change as dramatically as we've seen the Abortion Act change behaviour. Human nature is the same, whether it's in Oregon or in the Netherlands or in the United Kingdom. And we have laws because we believe that there are limits to human autonomy, and that we shouldn't be entitled to freedoms that endanger the reasonable freedoms of others. And this is what this is about. And that's why blanket prohibition with compassion in prosecuting and judging is the best one.
On pick this 6 months figure, less than 6 months. Two parts to my question. The first thing is, are they two signing medical professionals are different from the person who might decide that the person has less than 6 months to live? And a more complicated question is, diseases are different and they have different courses. Is there going to be some sort of standard guideline for a particular diagnosis that when a person reaches a certain stage of a disease, then that statistically is going to mean that they might have less than 6 months to live? And if so, the third question really, how do you deal with the ones that don't follow the statistics? So it seems to me that that's fundamental. Who decides the 6 months or less? And how do you make that prediction? It's a bit like a weather forecast, it might not happen into the future. And if you get it wrong, what are the implications of it being wrong for that particular person?
Well, the first question, it's the two doctors who sign the form. So they don't have to be specialists in the condition necessarily to know anything about it. It might be completely outside their specialty, but it's they who make the decision in good faith that the mentally competent adult with less than 6 months to live applies. The second question, it's extraordinarily difficult. And I never, as a general surgeon, having seen a lot of patients dying from cancer and other conditions, and patients always want you to say, how many months, doc, have I got? And as I'd say, if someone is really very close to death in the final days, you might be able to say, well, 95% likelihood they'll be dead in the next 48 hours. Once you get to weeks, very difficult. When you're talking about 6 months, you might be years out. And prognostication like that is a very inexact science. And this is why, when you talk about regulation, this is why it's so difficult, because all that's going to happen is a form will come back saying that this doctor thought this in good faith. And some of them will be wrong, terribly wrong, like they were in the case of Jeanette Hall in Oregon, who's alive 12 years later and very happy. And some of them will be malicious or will have an agenda or an ideological agenda. So it's 6 months to live is not a safeguard as far as I'm concerned.
In terms of there being a safeguard to have a criteria with less than 6 months left to live, the independent doctors, one of them has to be independent of the clinical team that are treating the patient. I'm not too sure about whether I would need to check whether they have to have the speciality involved for that. But one thing in terms of within each type of condition, there are academically and clinically agreed guidelines about prognosis and how patients progress through diseases. But the actual decision making will be made on a one-to-one basis, individually per patient.
The problem is you can't tell for the individual patient. We certainly talk about certain forms of cancer having, say, a 35% 5-year survival rate. So 35 out of 100 will be dead in 5 years. But you don't know whether you're one that will maybe live for 10 years. Or you might be one who's dead in a couple of weeks, you see. So what you say about populations and what you can say about individuals is very different. It's an incredibly inexact science. That's why it's so dangerous. You can't draw the line clearly. Mental, and don't get me onto mental competence, which is also incredibly difficult to assess for people who are not specialists. And Baroness Hollands, who is the current president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists and spoke on this bill recently in the House of Lords, said mental competence is incredibly difficult to assess, even for a consultant psychiatrist, let alone a GP, or maybe it'll be a pathologist or an anaesthetist or someone. They just have to be a medical practitioner. It's paper thin.
question is mainly for you, Greg. The Act talks obviously about, and its main aim is to be the actual person administering themselves with the drug. What will be the situation, and I mean, I glanced through the bill earlier and I thought it was a bit vague in this area, that, I mean, what will be the position if the person in question ticks all of the other boxes, but when it comes down to actually being physically able, I mean, we talked about being mentally able, but physically able to administer themselves, what if they can't? Will there just be okay, fine, you don't fit the criteria anymore?
No, within the law, the patient has to enact the final act of administering the life-ending medication. So that can be done in a number of ways. How best the clinical team feel is fit, as long as the patient is the one doing the final act. So for most people, it may be pressing a drip feed and making sure it is intravenously put into them. For other people, it can be numerous ways, as long as the stimuli that is enacting the administering of the drug is coming solely from that person. So, for some, for tetraplegics, for example, it could be eye coordination. It all depends, however it is best for them. But as long as the final act comes from them and not from a second or third party.
Again, you've got a tick in a box, and part of the problem in Oregon is that most of these assisted suicides are carried out under the auspices of an organisation called Compassion and Choices. The key witness is dead. You don't know really what happened. The drugs are dispensed, they're left in the community. Sometimes it's a long time before they're taken. If they struggled, who would know? If they were crushed up and put in a drink by someone and given unbeknownst, who would know? It's very difficult once you let lethal drugs out into the community. It's not as simple as it might sound.
I think it's a shame you've got such a cynical viewpoint towards...
Well, I've seen... I've told you exactly what happens in Belgium, the Netherlands and Oregon. These cases happen. And I don't think it's cynical. I think I'm just being realistic about human nature. I mean, most of us are studying law here, I think. The whole reason we have, not all of us maybe, but the whole reason we have laws is because you need laws to safeguard a society, and that's because not everybody can be trusted to act in a perfectly just way. And this is why, and particularly when it involves killing people, where there are big gains to be made, financially or emotionally for people, that's where you need really strong laws. So it's not cynicism, it's realism.
Thank you very much.
So it's a question. Yeah,
actually, not all of us are law students, so medic here.
I saw you waving. Yeah.
So I'm a bit more interested in the practicality. I can't nitpick about the law, whether it's a good bill or not. But what I'm interested in is, while in med school, what we're being taught currently is that for any treatment available or any procedure you might consider providing to a patient or any other service, what you're looking at is the quality of life they're going to have given the X treatment you're suggesting. So my question is, if someone is terminally ill and is only provided palliative care, I'm assuming, I might be wrong, please correct me if I am, that his quality of life is very likely to be not the best one, but not what exactly he would have wanted as a patient. So do you think it's right to deny him the right of a good quality life by removing his right to die the way he wants? So instead of going through this whole process of palliative care where his life is not the way he would have wanted it to be, he just has to live through it without having the option to die.
Well, I think it's very dangerous when we start making judgments about people's quality of life. And I think the problem with this whole area is that there is very little correlation between a person's physical condition and the desire to end their life. So on the one hand, you have Daniel James, the rugby player with tetraplegia, who desperately wanted to end his life and went to Dignitas. On the other, you have the Leicester rugby player, whose name I'm just trying to remember now.
Matt Hampson.
Sorry, Matt Hampson, yeah. And this is my early trouble with memory and things. But I've met Matt Hampson, and Matt broke his neck when a scrum collapsed. He was playing for the Leicester Tigers, and he campaigns to to help disabled people, and has an incredible zest for life. Two people with exactly the same condition. You can get 2 cancer patients the same. You can get 2 people with motor neuron disease the same. But what's also interesting is that you can get 2 people who are absolutely able-bodied, 2 teenagers, and one of them wants to kill themselves and the other doesn't. So, and even when we look at what's happening in Oregon, as I read out earlier, the figures, why is it that people want to end their lives? It's not because of pain or physical conditions. It's all about, loss of enjoyment of life. Life has lost its meaning. It's much more about existential reasons, spiritual reasons, if you like, than it is about physical reasons. So I think we've got to be very careful coming to the conclusion that because a person has an illness or a disability, that somehow their life is less worth living and that they might want to die, and they regard it as of less quality, because the way that people value their lives is very, very difficult. And the disabled people keep saying to me, nothing about us without us. Don't make judgments about us. So, of course, it brings you back to the point where we have to say, from my side of the argument, and we perhaps sound a bit hard in saying it, that yes, it means that there might be some people who desperately want to end their lives, who under the system I'm proposing, which is the current one, it remains illegal. But compassion will be shown under the current system in hard cases, and the law needs to stay the way it is because it protects a vast number of other vulnerable people, whether they're disabled or sick or elderly or depressed, from exploitation and abuse. And I would say that the prime function of government is actually to protect citizens, and particularly to protect the weaker ones that can be easily exploited. And that's why we need tough laws.
If you could respond, and then I'll go over there.
And the distinction between living and dying is an important one to note. With patients who have a terminal illness, they have not got sadly a long life ahead of them. They are facing an inevitable death, and they're going to die. That is the facts of life and death for them. And so with assisted dying, obviously good palliative care can control their pain, and that's all well and good, and promotion of good palliative care is a very good thing. But with assisted dying, it's based upon their experience of life, whether they feel they are suffering, what is their I suppose quality of life is very subjective between them, one person to another. But in terms of their experiences, it's an individual thing. Like you were saying, one person's experience to another can be different. And when it comes to people who are dying, that's the case in point, really. It's for them to choose, not for other people. It's for them to assess their own situation, their own quality of life, how they feel they're moving towards death quicker, unfortunately, than anyone else is doing. And when it comes to disabled people, the notion that it's nothing about us without us. To be frank, this law is not about disabled people who are not dying. It's about people who are dying, who have a terminal illness. Everyone should be included in lawmaking, whether you have a disability or not. Whether you're studying law, medicine, or whether you're just, disconnected from the situation, whether you've got a general interest as a member of the public. Everyone should be included in their opinions, but when it comes to making the law, It's parliamentarians who do that, and that's why the bill's in front of them.
I've been enjoying it.
Put us on side practical and legal considerations and look at the simplest question of morality. Are you completely euthanasia?
Sorry, me?
Yeah.
Me personally, yes, and I think I take the same view. Obviously, I mean, I'm General Secretary or I'm Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship, and so that will inform my own personal moral views. I haven't used, as you'll see, any of those arguments tonight. I've argued from grounds of public safety and consequences, because I think not necessarily everyone shares my convictions. But I think what's also very interesting is that if you look back in medicine, that historically, going right back to the Hippocratic Oath, all the way up through all the modern codes, Declaration of Geneva, International Code of Medical Ethics, Statement of Marbella, everything the medical profession is saying today, it's been uniformly against the idea of doctors being able intentionally to end the lives of their patients, either by helping them kill themselves or by ending their lives for them. Hippocratic Oath, I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest such counsel. And I think that's a fundamental Rubicon that as doctors we should not be crossing. I think what concerns me about this whole thing, or one of the things that concerns me, is that, as I said, most people who want it don't want it for medical reasons, they want it for existential reasons. It's loss of meaning, loss of hope, depression, desperation, despair, that kind of thing. And I think it's very dangerous when doctors come in and start providing medical solutions to what are really spiritual or existential problems. I think that puts us on a very dangerous course indeed.
The position you're taking is more out of morality. I think the medical down here is making the point that there's some utilitarian element down here, which I think has merit. And I think
utilitarianism is a form of morality.
Yes,
everyone has a worldview and a set of moral principles that they apply.
But utilitarianism within medicine.
Sorry?
Utilitarianism within medicine, I think, is the argument that's down here in terms of thinking about the best outcome.
But just by using the word best, you see, you're bringing in a moral judgment. Because then I'd say, well, how do you define best? You can't even talk about best. You can't invest best with any meaning without having a moral framework, you see. So all of us operate from a moral framework of some sort or another.
I guess that goes back to if you're going to a utilitaristic argument, if you want to undergo an act or a rule theory of utilitarianism, then you could argue both ways with those. I don't know if utilitarianism is the right way necessarily, but the question I wanted to ask was, do you think that there is a place for a person who's in a particularly difficult place in a lot of pain, and for a family member to go out of their way, in the way the law allows at the moment, for them to take them to Dignitas or allow them to end their own life and then rely on the leniency of the law? Do you think that there is a place for that morally in society?
Well, I think your example is interesting because you're using the word pain again. And Greg has said, and on the basis of the Oregon stats I've given you and the experience of palliative care doctors, this is not about pain. Because someone who is a consultant in palliative medicine will tell you, if it's pain, bring them on. And I may not be able to completely alleviate it, but I will substantially reduce it to the point that they will no longer see the pain as a reason to die. And that's my point, is that this is much more about meaning and purpose and despair and being unable to adapt to disability and that kind of thing than it is about pain. And if anyone's going to Dignitas because their pain can't be controlled, then I'd say they haven't seen the right doctors. And someone who says that, that they can't relieve the pain, then should be referring to someone who's got the skills to be able to handle that properly.
I
No,
don't
not-
think
not-
people
not
refer
even-
to pain clinically, though. I think
Sorry?
when people talk about pain, they're not necessarily talking from a clinical perspective. I think the impression I get from Greg when he's talking about pain is it isn't just about the physical aches and pains and being uncomfortable, but it's actually feeling
Emotional.
yeah, and I'd say that that pain is multifaceted beyond nociception.
Yes, I agree, and I think there's mental pain or mental torment as well. But then, you know, I don't quite understand why. I mean, normally our response to suicide, if you had a young person who was desperately depressed, or maybe they had a terrible mental illness, or they were a victim of drug abuse or whatever, and they really wanted to end it all, no one could talk them out of it. There's no one running up giving them, a lethal cocktail. We do everything we possibly can to help them to look differently on their situation. And I think that's, given that there's no real strong correlation between physical illness and the desire to die, I think we should be handling all suicidal ideation the same way. And I think that the best way for the medical profession is to have these Rubicons that you don't cross. And that's, in a way, is what's driven medicine forward over the last few centuries, to be able to develop all the treatments that we have today for things. And of course, we're never going to stop people dying or suffering, and death and disease are all part of life, and we're all going to die at some point. And for many of us, it won't be pleasant. But I would say the best approach to that is to say, let's do the very best that we can to provide the best care for as many people as we can, and not go down this route, because once you open the door, it can be very difficult to stop, as I've, I think, demonstrated.
Thank you, Peter. My name's John Jones. I think it's very difficult for clinicians and those of faith to actually discuss issues of euthanasia because of the global principle of doing no harm, as is embodied both in religion, in the majority of religions, and also in the Hippocratic Oath, from those that have taken the oath or even those that haven't. But I think it's obfuscation to say, well, it depends on the condition, it depends on the person, it depends on this. I'll give you an example of that. I have no religion. I'm probably culturally Christian, because I was brought up in a Christian way, in a Christian country. And even though I call myself an atheist, I'm probably agnostic. I take a scientific view to life. But I think it would be wrong if I had a condition, and I don't want to focus upon there being one condition. Say I have something that's easy, like a cancer, and I'm given treatment, and it doesn't get better, it gets worse. There'll be a point when I want to say, when medics say there's no more we can do.
Sorry,
There's no more we can do.
Yeah.
And you're going to die in 6 months. That 6 months is not going to be, on the whole, productive for me, whether that's psychologically or physically damaging to me. But I have to endure, at the moment, unless I have a sympathetic medic, pain, both psychological and physical, that I don't want. I may be pleading to be killed because I'm incapable of doing it, because of, and yet there is no legislation to save me. There is no legislation to protect me, which is almost, I think the greatest exemplar of that is that if it was an animal, we'd be prosecuted. If an animal was in that situation and we didn't take it to a vet who said, this animal, this dog, this cat needs to be destroyed.
Well, but we're not
Well,
animals. We're not animals, and I think also,
Well, we are animals.
but it's interesting today.
We're just different animals.
Well, people it's amazing how much people will spend on their pets. And many people with pets are going down the palliative care route, and the reality is that I've managed many dying patients, and I can tell you that people who are dying think about life and their decisions in very different ways than you and I who are well. I had a good friend who looked after the president of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society in New Zealand, where I originally came from. And this guy came in with a mesothelioma, one of the worst cancers you can get. Cancer of the lining of the lung. He had big pleural effusions, bloody fluid collecting in his lungs. He needed a needle stuck in every day to drain it off. It was pretty awful. It wasn't a great way to die. There are many better ways. But this guy was terrified that because of who he was, someone would slip him something or make a judgment. He hadn't finished, and he adapted to his condition. And interestingly, right up to the time of death, he never ever asked for the euthanasia needle or any help. And what I'm saying to you, from my experience, and I've had, obviously, like anyone, I've had people in my family dying of terrible things. I've looked after many dying patients. I got very close to them. And all I would say to you is that they make decisions in very different ways. They value life in different ways. They have a very different perspective. And that even in the presence of great suffering, life does not end lose its meaning. And lots of people who are suffering greatly still want to live on. The overwhelming vast majority, they want every single day they can get. Because you're talking about, protection and saving, but what you're really talking about is having helped to kill oneself. And when you're dead, that's it. And most people really value life, even if it's life that you and I would judge of very low quality. They assess things in different ways.
Point. Again, it's obfuscation. Talk about others. I'm talking about me. Why should I not have the protection of law? What you're talking about is protecting everyone in exactly the same way. In fact, you said one thing that rather shocked me, to say that everyone with, I think it was suicidal ideation should be treated exactly the same. And I was stunned. Because that is wrong.
No, well, I think
you're dependent upon their need.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you absolutely. And I think you misunderstood what I was trying to say. Right. What I was trying to say is that when people have suicidal ideation, yes, we need to meet their exact needs, meet them where they are, depending on their unique circumstances. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't be helping them to kill themselves.
What about me?
Well, what about you? Well,
what if I wanted at that time the protection of law to say there are two, protecting doctors or loved ones, preferably doctors, because I'm going to have probably a painless and less distressing death than going out in the streets and getting, heroin or whatever.
Yeah, and
what about me? I want that, and I want those doctors protected. They should not be punished because of my needs and my abilities. And what you're saying is I'm not allowed to have that. I'm afraid it's a really powerful argument, and I've met many of the campaigners on the other side, and I have a lot of sympathy with them as human beings. But in order to give you the right to kill, the right to have someone help you kill yourself, which is what we're talking about, you have to at the same time give the power and authority to a doctor to dispense those lethal drugs. And by changing the law in that way to give you that liberty, you cannot do it whilst not at the same time removing legal protection from other people. And at the end of the day, it's a balance of harms. And the argument that's always persuaded Parliament, and we know most people in Parliament have no faith perspective, they're not coming from any absolute perspective at all. But the argument that's persuaded them has been this concern about public safety. You hear, David Cameron and Nick Clegg and Gordon Brown, they're all saying the same thing. If we change the law, we put pressure on vulnerable people to end their lives for fear of being a burden. And that's really the bottom line for me. And yes, I'm afraid that does mean
that there are some people who desperately might want to die and are unable to commit suicide and would need help to do it themselves, who will not be able to. But that I'm afraid is preferable to having a removal of that legal protection, so that people die when others have a financial or care interest in their death. And that's the bottom line. The law's a blunt instrument. There's always going to be cases that make us think. But I think that the current system we have is still the best one, or the least worst, if you like.
We'll take one more question from you two. I think you were first, right? The girl. Oh, both?
The law in its current state, I'm going to talk a little bit more generally here, but I think it applies to the people that are covered by this bill as well, doesn't stop people committing suicide. The biggest killer of someone my age, and anyone else, any male my age in this room, is suicide. So don't you think that a law that says to people, okay, well then you can come to the doctor and talk about suicide, rather than, no, we can't give that to you, go and do it yourself, which they then go and do. Don't you think if they can come and talk to it, then perhaps there's some good, and that some people will be persuaded not to?
Yes, but there's nothing to stop a patient talking about their suicidal thoughts to a doctor now, or to anybody else now.
In my experience with suicidal people, and unfortunately I've had a few, they're generally very resistant to go and talk to a doctor, and the fact that it's such a massive killer of people my age would suggest that, well, they're talking to their doctors about it, but even if, a massive amount of them must not be, or something's wrong there.
Yes, well, we come back. I mean, it's interesting. We started with Natalie giving an outline of the history of the law in this country, and up until 1961, when the Suicide Act came in, it was illegal to commit suicide. Now you've got to think about that a bit. But what it meant was that if you attempted to kill yourself and you weren't successful, you could be prosecuted. And people said, hang on, what's going on here? These people are desperately in need, and then we're adding insult to injury by prosecuting them. This is ridiculous. And so it was that compassionate concern and the recognition that most people who are suicidal, coming from a background of mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, statistically, that they needed to change the law. But what they decided in 61 was that whereas they decriminalised suicide, they would not decriminalise assistance with suicide. And the reason they kept that in place, and that we've got the law today with the 14-year discretionary sentence that is never used but acts as a disincentive, the reason they left it is because they saw the possibility of exploitation and abuse. And it's interesting, of the 91 cases that have been referred to the DPP over the last 5 years, there has been one conviction for assisted suicide. But what's very interesting also is there have been 5 that were referred on for murder convictions. In other words, when the police looked at the evidence and the key witness was dead, they decided, hang on, I don't think this was a case of assisted suicide. I think it was a case of the assister ending the life and then claiming that it was actually assisted suicide. You see, that's the problem with allowing assistance for suicide. So that's why the law is the way it is.
But is net good enough? I mean, if we put this law in place and it did end up helping people, and that it might convince them against suicide, and then if they really do want it, they go on to have it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Doesn't that balance out the people that the system abuses? I mean, I'm of the opinion that most doctors would act in good faith. The Harold Shipman among us is very rare. So these abusers, You've spent all night talking about them, but I believe, honestly, they're going to be rather small compared to this good that I talk about. And is that net good enough?
Well, we live in an imperfect world when nothing's ever perfect or good enough. We're talking about least bad situations. But I think, come back to this, that the reason we have laws is because if we didn't have them, then there would be, they act as a very powerful disincentive to abuse and exploitation. And Martin Luther King says, you can't change people's hearts. Laws don't change people's hearts, but they do restrain the heartless. And the law is, that's why the law is there, with the penalties it holds in reserve. The law is an ass, the law is a blunt instrument, there are always hard cases that make us wonder about the law. That's the nature of law and the nature of human nature. But I put the case to you tonight that this is a law that's really important, and if we weaken it, we will see the same sort of incremental extension abuse that we're seeing in these other jurisdictions.
I have many questions myself.
Okay.
Do you want to?
I did want to just yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
In terms of the assisted dying bill, which I'll just nick your phrase, it is a law which is really important and should be brought into function. Is that one of the key cornerstones is transparency. If you are a terminally ill patient and you've reached a point where you're now requesting an assisted death, something has gone wrong. Something has gone wrong. You've either your current palliative care is not working for you, and so you need it reviewed, and you need all the information given to you, which is a key requirement of the bill, or your palliative care is of very good quality, and everyone is doing all they possibly can for you, and you are doing for yourself. But there's a multifaceted pain, a sense of things are coming to an end, and you feel that you're not happy with your current quality of life. So at that point, there is an opportunity to either redress the palliative care and to review it, or for you as an individual to make that individual choice about what is right for you. Also, investigations at this event, this decision event, currently everything is done once you're dead. Everyone that has been involved and that is not protected by the law is now facing the full force of the British law system. Without you there, the key witness is dead. They are no longer there to provide any evidence. All your loved ones and those who were brave enough to realise that you wanted help to help yourself, they are now left without any opportunity to bring forward the key witness. With the assisted dying bill, the investigation, the checks, the balances are all put in place, all reviewed upon the decision event of you making that choice. You're still there to talk to everyone involved. You're there to sign papers, just there to write letters on your own accord. You've got the emotional aspect about being around your family and having a death that you've controlled and you've chose yourself. But that aside, that emotional argument aside, you've now got a position whereby you can go through a process where you're at the heart of it, you're not at the end of it as an afterthought, and where the focus is on everyone else being prosecuted. Peter is right, the 14-year prosecution is not used on a regular basis, but you've still got people who are bailed, you've got people who are charged with aiding and abetting, you've got the stress of that, it's on their criminal record. It's really, in terms of tonight's title being should we pass the assisted dying bill, the ultimate question is, do you want to put choice and control into the hands of individuals and protecting vulnerable people with clear boundaries about what does not apply to them clearly, I'm sure, say, if this assisted dying bill is passed, you are bound to get some disabled people, you know, the rugby player with tetraplegia, go to his GP and say, I've heard about the assisted dying law, it's been passed, I want it. And he'll be told, or she'll be told clearly at that point, I'm sorry, it's not for you. Again, another opportunity for doctors to say, why did you ask for it in the first place? What is wrong? I have a spinal cord injury. I was paralysed when I was age 7 through an operation. Personally, I don't want to die. I'm too busy going to debates with people like you, Peter. And so
it gives life meaning, doesn't it?
And so you know, it's opportunities whereby either if you're terminally ill, and then you can review your palliative care, or opportunities for people who aren't dying to be told it's not available for them. That is a clear safeguard within the bill. But what else can we offer to help you? And it puts the investigation while you're still alive, while the dying person is still there, to say, hold on, it was my choice. These people aren't, circling me like vultures, ready for the kill. This has all been done, and I'm at the centre of it. So, we can talk about safeguards. We can talk about prognosis, which is a really key point to make. And when you actually look upon the individual decisions, they are made on a one-to-one basis, which can be done by 2 independent doctors. That is, nothing is rushed. There's a 14-day waiting period minimum for people who aren't very close to death. And it's these sort of safeguards which put in place protections for terminally ill people and their relatives away from prosecution, and for those who aren't dying to be told it's not for you. It's a law not about disabled people, but they should be included to get their opinion on the issue. And so what I would ask, and I'm going to continue asking, is that disabled leaders and disabled rights groups start talking to their members to make sure that they are actually, involving them in the policy development process.
Would you like to come down and meet some of the disabled people's leaders that we work with and talk to them?
More than happy.
We'd be delighted to have you.
Great.
Great. Well, I have many questions myself. So you can join us in the wine reception. You can ask.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah.
Ask. So yeah, again, thank you.